Chapter 32 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex Lella. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards, Chapter 32, William Tell. Many hundreds of years ago, at the end of the 13th century to be exact, in the country that is now Switzerland, there lived a Swiss hunter and herdsman named William Tell. He lived in the little town of Burglen among the mountains, and with him lived his wife and his 2 sons, who, when this story opens, were about 10 and 12 years old. William Tell was so strong that his name was known far and wide. He was so skillful a hunter that nothing seemed ever to escape his keen arrow when once it was on the wing. He was so venturesome a mountain climber that the steepest precipice was not too dangerous for him. And with all these great abilities, he had a kindly disposition, and was liked as well as admired by his neighbors. William Tell had won more than one prize at the fairs and competitions that were sometimes held near his town. On one occasion, he had shot a small bird on the wing with his sure arrow, for the bull's-eye of the target had seemed too large for him. And so it came to pass that when his neighbors revolted from the foreign yoke that Austria had thrown over Switzerland, Tell was one of the first to be called on by the patriots who desired to free their country. Switzerland was not a single country in those days, but was divided into the 3 cantons, or districts of Schwyz, from which it takes its present name, Uri, and Unterwalden. The Austrians had nominally governed the country for a long time without any dissent on the part of the Swiss people, for the Austrian ruler named Adolf had treated them extremely well and allowed them to keep their ancestral rights and customs. Then, however, the Habsburg Emperor Albrecht came to the throne, and discontent and misery were soon apparent in the Swiss cantons, for the new monarch did not follow the policy of the former king, but sent cruel governors to rule over the honest Swiss, with secret orders to oppress them in many ways until their love of liberty, for which they had always been famous, might be destroyed. All the time that these changes were taking place, William Tell went quietly about his affairs. He looked after his herds and hunted in the mountains, while his wife Hedvig saw to his house and brought up his 2 boys, William and Walter. He had everything to make him happy: a clean and well-ordered home on the side of the mountain, a devoted wife, 2 manly boys, and a herd of cattle that included the most beautiful cow for miles around. This cow was named Hefele, and wore a sweet-toned bell about her neck. Driving a cow over the mountain paths was a difficult and dangerous undertaking, and one that Tell had never entrusted to either of his children. But as his son William seemed to be able and venturesome, he was allowed one day, as a great pleasure, to drive Hefele and her calf up the mountain pasture. The way led alongside of a cliff, and in one place it was so narrow that only a few inches separated those on the path from a terrific gulf so deep that the clouds sometimes hid the trees below it. While the boy was driving Hefele over this place, with a sudden rush a fierce eagle swooped down to attack the calf, beating the air with its wings to drive the calf to the edge of the precipice. And although the lad struck at the bird of prey with his mountain staff until the air was filled with feathers, it was to no avail. The calf plunged over the ledge and was dashed to death on the rocks beneath where the eagle descended, and promptly reappeared, flying heavily away, bearing the dead body of the calf in its claws. But this was not all the trouble that young Tell was to undergo, for the cow lurched towards the edge of the precipice and sought some way to descend to the spot where she believed the body of her calf had fallen, and try as he would, young Tell could not get her away from the spot or drive her back to her stall. So he tied Hefele to a tree and went in search of his father, to whom he told the misfortune that had befallen him. Whereupon father and son went in search of the eagle, and the elder Tell slew it with an arrow from his crossbow, and on this trip he taught his son to show no fear of the high precipices they had to skirt, or of the gulfs that had to be crossed by fallen trees. And from that time on, he instructed his son to avoid the least sign of fear, which later saved both their lives in a curious manner. There was nothing that Tell hated more than the Austrian rule under the tyrannical governors who were sent to oppress the Swiss, and he engaged in opposing them first of all. One of the Swiss, named Wolfshot, had treacherously deserted his countrymen and joined the Austrian cause, for which he was rewarded by the emperor and given a position under the Austrian governor. In this position he did all that he could to annoy his neighbors, and frequently insulted the Swiss women. On one occasion Wolfshot tried to make love to the wife of a Swiss peasant named Baumgarten, who was an honest as well as a brave man. She ran to her husband for protection, and Baumgarten, in great anger, went to the room where Wolfshot was staying and slew him with an axe. Then, taking horse, he fled for his life, pursued by the Austrian guards. Baumgarten came to the shores of Lake Zurich and would have crossed the lake to safety, but a terrible wind called the Föhn was blowing, and the waves of the lake rolled so high that escape by water seemed impossible. The horsemen were close at Baumgarten's heels, and he begged the ferryman to take him across the water in spite of the danger, but to no avail. The ferryman replied that he would not venture out on the lake in that storm to save the life of anyone, for it was impossible for any boat to live in the sea that was raging there. But William Tell was present, and seeing that Baumgarten would soon be captured by the Austrians, he ran with him to the ferry boat and pushed off just as the Austrians rowed up to the shore. The boat was tossed about like a cork, but still it lived under the powerful strokes of Tell, who was skillful above all others with the oar, and the Austrians were forced to go back to their castle without their prisoner, bitterly angry at Tell for having helped the fugitive to escape them. This was soon brought to the ears of the new governor, named Gessler, who determined that he would entrap Tell into committing some other act by which he could be imprisoned and put to death. To accomplish this purpose, Gessler conceived the design of placing a cap with the royal arms of Austria upon it in the midst of the public square of the town of Altdorf, where Tell frequently came, and of ordering all people to bow before it, as if this cap were the Emperor of Austria himself. Great was the anger felt by the Swiss when they heard of this infamous design on Gessler's part. But how much more when the cap was actually taken to the public square by a force of heavily armed soldiers, and a proclamation was read ordering all who saw it to salute it on pain of whatever penalty the governor saw fit to impose. Now Tell happened to be in Altdorf at this very time with his little son William, and in order to avoid saluting this hated emblem, he left town earlier than he had planned, and by a street where he thought he would not see the cap or encounter any of the Austrians who had come to Altdorf to see that the governor's order was enforced. As luck would have it, however, Tell walked right into the square where the cap had been placed, and came right upon it before he noticed it, and several Austrian men-at-arms stood near it. Without a word, leading his little son by the hand, Tell strode past the cap without bowing his head, and was at once stopped by the soldiers, who told him he was under arrest for defying the governor's order, and made ready to take him before Gessler for trial. But Gessler himself had seen all this, and was so eager to punish Tell that he did not wait for the soldiers to come to him, but with his servants and retainers hastened out into the square. Gessler knew Tell by sight, and spoke to him by name. "What does this mean, Tell?" he demanded. "Have you not heard that this cap represents the Emperor, and is to be saluted by all that pass it?" "Aye, your lordship," answered Tell. "And so you propose to add defiance of my person to your other crime?" said the governor. "I have you in my power now, and you shall pay a dear penalty. All the more dearly shall you pay because you go about the streets, armed with your crossbow at your side." "My bow is used for hunting, your lordship," said Tell proudly, "a right that all free men possess, and have possessed from the very earliest times." "I'll curb your right and your talk of freedom," said Gessler fiercely. "Yonder is your son. Now hearken to your punishment. Take your bow and shoot an apple from the child's head." Now the governor never thought that Tell could hit so difficult a mark, and Tell himself, good shot as he was, quailed at shooting at so small a target when the slightest slip would cause him to kill his beloved son. And he begged the governor to take his property if he would, or do what he chose to his person, but to spare an innocent boy who had done no harm or wrong of any kind. Gessler, however, was inexorable, and he mocked Tell with the utmost cruelty, telling him that such a mark should be easy for one whose fame as a bowman had travelled through all Switzerland as Tell's had done. "And mark well my words," said Gessler, "see that you hit the apple, for if you miss it, even by a hair's breadth, then you shall die, and the boy with you." A groan went through the crowd that had assembled as Gessler spoke these words. But young William himself was not afraid, and went bravely to the tree where he was to stand, and with his own hand put the apple on his head. "Shoot, father! Why do you hesitate?" he cried. "Well do I know that you will hit the apple." With a shudder Tell took his crossbow and drew 2 arrows from his quiver. Then, holding his breath, he aimed at the living mark. The bowstring twanged. The arrow, like a flash of lightning, split the apple in 2 halves and embedded itself in the tree trunk. Tell had triumphed, and the deed was accomplished. Turning to Gessler and taking his boy by the hand, Tell asked leave to go his way, now that his order had been obeyed. But Gessler was determined to slay Tell, and was only seeking some pretext for getting him into his power. "Not so fast," said the crafty governor, while he eyed the bow with which Tell had so bravely performed the cruel operation. "Tell me, my shrewd archer, who does not hesitate to aim at his own flesh and blood, why did you draw 2 arrows from your quiver instead of 1? Tell drew himself to his full height, and, captive as he was, the governor quailed beneath his glance. "The second arrow was for you, in case I had shot my son," said Tell fiercely. "If so much as a drop of his blood had been drawn, my second bolt would have been lodged in your false heart." "Bind him!" shouted Gessler, overjoyed that Tell had delivered himself into his hands. "In my own castle it shall be decided what sort of death and torture he shall suffer." And with Tell led between 2 horsemen, the governor's retinue went to the shore of the lake to cross to the castle where he made his home. When the boat was well out in the lake, however, the same terrible wind that so often blew upon its waters arose with the swiftness of a thunderclap and threatened to overwhelm them all. Tell lay bound in the boat, calmly watching what he could see of the storm, when one of the governor's servants told him that Tell himself was the most skillful boatman in that part of the country, and the only one who could save them from the waves that threatened each minute to swamp them. At this, Tell's bonds were cut, and he was ordered by the governor to take his place at the helm and guide the boat to shore, and Gessler added that if he brought it safely in, it would serve to lessen the punishment that he planned to inflict upon him. Tell did as he was ordered and took the tiller, and by his skillful guidance the craft gradually drew near to shore. But Tell had planned shrewdly as he guided the boat, and he gradually drew it toward a ledge of rock that was greatly feared by all the boatmen of the lake. When the boat was directly beneath the rock, Tell waited until a wave flung the boat on high, and seizing his crossbow and arrows, he sprang from the gunwale, landed on the rock, and disappeared into the forest. Gessler was enraged at Tell's escape, but he and his party had all they could do to save their lives from the fury of the lake. At last, more by luck than skill, they drew the craft into smoother waters, and he and his retinue were saved. Tell, however, had formed a stern purpose while fleeing through the forest. He knew that his own life and that of his son, and perhaps of his entire family, would be lost if Gessler lived, for the governor would certainly send soldiers to take and slay him. So Tell resolved to slay the governor with the same crossbow with which he had shot the apple from his son's head. He waited in the woods on the edge of a ravine through which Gessler must pass on the way to his castle at Küssnacht, for no other way led there. And when the governor's escort finally appeared, Tell aimed his bow, the arrow hissed from the string, and embedded itself squarely in Gessler's heart. The deed was accomplished surely and with skill, and the Swiss would suffer no more from the heavy hand of the tyrant Gessler. This act rang through Switzerland, and everywhere people were soon in revolt against the power of Austria, and the ultimate result of the action of William Tell was in the end the freedom of the Swiss people from the oppression of Austria. And throughout Switzerland the name of William Tell is revered to this day, and there are statues in his honor, while many a legend has been born in his name, and many a great writer has celebrated his deeds. End of chapter 32. Recording by Alex Lella.